Rabbi Professor Dahan. Now we'll turn to the English segment of the event. We're so pleased to invite Professor Suzan Laasst Stone, who is on all sides of the world, and we know her in Israel, at Tel Aviv University, at Hardman, and then we think of her as a part of Hebrew University as well. She also spends time and teaches in New York at Cardozo Law School, and a leading scholar and really a model of scholarship of Jewish law.
Thank you, David. So I am going to do my part in hastening the translation of this amazing book into English by speaking in English. I will prepare the ground. But I also want to really, thank David and particularly Benny for inviting me to speak, especially now, because it is immensely gratifying and even an occasion of joy to have a reason to be connected to all of you when I can't be over there physically. So it's really, really, thank you very, very much. So Benny's overarching project, as David already said, but he didn't say it in English, so I will repeat it in English, right, is to locate and explain this just disjuncture between the biblical approach to social justice and that of Chazal, who both continue but also basically tame the biblical project. And in Benny's words, the Bible is utopian. Mummy doesn't like that word, I gather, to describe it quite. But Benny describes it as both utopian, but also revolutionary. And revolutionary is important. The revolutionary aspect of it is that it's aiming actually to alter the status quo. Those who are poor do not need to remain so, right? There can be a complete reshuffling, right, of where people are located in life, so that the poor, right, are depicted as active and not passive, and they need a stimulus, right? Some sort of help to get them to move to a completely different place. And therefore, as we already discussed a little bit, the striking central biblical command is really to lend, right? Not to give, right? To lend money. Now, in place of that, what Chazal do is build up an institution and culture of charity, right? Which assumes this most important duty to sustain the poor, but it preserves the status quo, right? The poor are anonymous. They don't seem to have any character. In that way, it kind of goes along with what I think Mummy just said, which is that there seems to be very little reflection from the perspective of why are the poor, where they are, what's causing it. And they're not lifted to a new class. They're going to stay poor, but they're going to survive. What causes this change is part of the dilemma that Benny puts on the table. And he's quick to say in what is, of course, his usual methodological intervention, which I think is very important, is that we have to approach all of this not as historians, right? Even historians of Jewish law, but we have to approach these questions conceptually. That is, conceptual change happens within, right, intellectual thought. And that conceptual change has relative autonomy. Right? It is intersecting with social and economic and political changes, but it also has a life of its own. So the two conceptual shifts that we've partly discussed already, that he points out as important here are, first of all, the loss of sovereignty, right? Basically ruling over a small group, not a large group, not shaping political space, but secondly, a kind of larger shift altogether towards realism, right? And institution building, right? And a little suspicion towards something that is too grand and therefore perhaps ineffective. I want to draw out a different part of the book, which we haven't yet discussed, though David began the conversation about it, and that is the tension between religious elements and social elements. So far, we've really spoken about charities and its social implications. But a large part of the book actually analyzes and addresses a very important and I think interesting question that has to do with what happens, right? When religion is placed inside a legal framework. What are the problems and what occurs? So Benny in chapters 4 and 5 focuses very strongly on the legal character of charity and explores also this question of charity as an obligation and charity as a right in the thought of Chazal. Now, I'm not adding anything new here. I'm really summarizing and in some ways testing, because long ago I taught a unit on coercing charity, and I'm not entirely certain I got it right. And so I'm going to, in part, reflect on and summarize what Benny has to say about this, and then hope that Benny's going to correct me. So one of the things that has not been yet mentioned is one fundamental conceptual switch that comes from what we might call the rise of the individual in late antiquity, and especially among all the religions, really, an emphasis on the idea of individual salvation. It's in that context that charity gets a very particular religious overtone. As David said, right, it turns into being, right, into, the word would be righteousness, but righteousness in the sense of being able to be admitted into the kingdom of heaven. Right? And that's a very central aspect behind the dilemmas that are posed by this new focus on charity. So let me put it this way. Right? Benny puts it this way. How do we understand charity? Do we understand it as a religious obligation, a mitzvah that is between man and God? Or do we understand it as a social obligation between man and man? And what's the stakes for classifying it one way or the other? Well, certainly in Western culture, right, charity would be thought of as under the topic of ethics or religion. That is, it's dependent on volition or choice. And indeed, it seems kind of definitional to the whole topic of giving, that it is based on, right, an idea of voluntarism, right? You give a gift and it's freely given. So what happens when you preempt or legalize ethics and you bring it into the domain of law? Are you also going to use all the mechanisms of law, coercion, social control, fines, punishment into the picture? And on the one hand, right, you want to do the commandments out of love, voluntarily. On the other hand, absent utopia, without these coercive mechanisms, the social dimension of charity will be lost. So a similar dilemma, I think, pervades the question of obligations and rights. And I'll put it this way. The focus seems to be so vividly on the performer of the mitzvah. Right? Obligations and the discourse of obligations, and here I'm borrowing very freely from Robert Cover and others, right, puts its eye on the one who does the commandments. And it obscures from view the object, right, of the command. That person fades, right? Whereas when we speak about a right to charity, or a right to income, or a right to sustenance, right? It's the object of the command that comes into view. It loses, that object loses sight. In short, the concern for free will in matters of religion and the value of doing commandments out of love knocks against commandments that have a social dimension. It's a huge tension. So what did the rabbis do? And this is really the subject of chapter 4, right? Benny is investigating how Chazal, and even more so later in the Middle Ages, attempted to resolve this. By and large, right? Now, it's true, of course, that the rabbis didn't have a problem coercing commandments in general. But I should mention that charity actually is a special case, because not only is it a gift like a sacrifice, which seems to require free will, but it's also set in a complex of commandments, as Chazal identifies, in which scripture specifies the reward or punishment. And as the rabbis understand it, these commandments should not be coerced. So now we have something else that's again tugging on charity. the dilemma of the will, but also this picture of a dual jurisdictional system, heavenly justice and judicial justice, that also runs really throughout rabbinic thought. And I think that's useful in thinking through some of the resolutions that Benny cites about coercing charity. So I'd like to go over two of these resolutions and then propose a third. First solution, right? Benny basically tries to locate the question as primarily being, in the end of the day, right, more a social rather than religious obligation. Not only does he note the tension, but he also speaks about how to resolve that tension. And one way of resolving that tension is really to return to the discourse of jurisdiction and jurisdictional battles between the heavenly and the earthly court. Right? It's, as Benny says later, he speaks about the fact that that what Chazal did is they focused very much on the question whether the court can compel, right? But other figures could, right, they were an easier time. Compulsion in the story of Rava, for example, may be a story of others compelling, but not the court. The anxiety is the court, right? And I think that that's a revealing aspect of a religious tension that is permeating this particular problem. There's a second way in which they try to resolve this dilemma between the religious and the social aspects of the command. And the second solution is actually positing a prior commitment. And this solution is actually more radical. And I think Benny is hinting that it actually continues aspects of the biblical model, right? The idea here is that funds or gifts are in reality already committed to the poor, right? That is, they belong to the poor and are the property of the poor, even before they are given, right, by someone. And Benny concludes after meticulous analysis that the rabbis continued this line of thought when it came to thinking about field gifts. And maybe that was influenced by the fact that in general, aspects of agricultural gifts of the field were related to the land, and the land in general was thought of as belonging to God, not to the Baal Habayit, right, or the owner. But they did not think that way in terms of non-agricultural gifts. But I actually wonder whether that is precisely what the medieval resolution is based on. So if we take, for example, someone like the Ritva, he seems to be asserting a much more radical idea, even in the context of non-field rights. He seems to be saying that the court is not coercing the fulfillment of a commandment. It's only coercing a prior commitment that arises from the very fact of the needs of the poor, which the Bible specifically states will always be with you, right? And sets it up in that way. So there's a third solution. I don't recall a discussion of this third solution. It may be there, Benny, but I think it's worth mentioning. And that is, the third solution is to redefine what we mean by free will, right? What does it mean to do something voluntarily? Maybe we can coerce and still maintain a concept of willingness. So, for example, Maimonides is well known, uses this in the context of divorce. We coerce until the husband gives the divorce of his own free will. And that may reflect the notion of the legal subject as a rational agent who always wants to do the right thing. But I think more importantly for our purpose, the case of the wife in divorce is like the case of charity, right? There are classes of mitzvot that exert pressure because of the object of the mitzvah, right? And in that way, the poor and the wife can be analogized. These are mitzvot that create the special challenge, right? They require that we modify notions of free will precisely because we have a third party, right? So I now want to turn, right? I think that's an interesting question that we might further discuss. And I now want to turn to something contemporary as Hanoch and Momi did. And I'm going to do it as an outsider here, on how to think with these sources as resources, right, in a Jewish and democratic state. And Benny notes that early Israeli thinkers were drawn to the biblical model as a resource. It offered a political vision that fit, right, perhaps the revolutionary politics of Zionism. And I can attest, embarrassingly so, by the way, that, you know, I've had political figures approach me to be on panels to discuss the latest legislation and how the latest legislation is really a reenactment of, right, the sabbatical year or the Yovel, and we're all going to cancel it, right? But anything that has to do with any form of cancellation of debts and bankruptcy. Right, and Benny asks, is there something that is important to retrieve from the more quietist, but maybe more realistic rabbinic model that focuses on institutions, right? That's very important. But I want to raise a third model, and this is as an outsider. And that model is neither charity nor welfare social justice state. It's philanthropy, right? So I raise it because it is, after all, a prominent aspect of American society. And it seems to me, very oddly muted in Israeli society. So there's a list that's maintained, right, of, right, how philanthropic are nations by comparison to their actual wealth. And Israel doesn't score that high, right, or surprisingly low for a culture that has its roots in both the biblical vision and the rabbinic vision of charity. And so in what way is philanthropy actually quite different from charity? What's lacking here? They're not the same. After all, what we might say, echoing features that Benny emphasized, is that charity is a communal value. It exists in a small space. It is modeled in some way around the family, right? Its core is interpersonal, real persons, right? It's the need of your brother, right? And the outstretched hand, and you need to meet that outstretched hand, right? But philanthropy is actually a political virtue, and it's tied to particular political cultures. And those political cultures, right, are about, right, have strong civil societies by and large, and they create and foster a kind of intermediate realm between the realm of the family and the realm of the state, right? And those intermediate, by organizing and participating in this sort of sphere, Americans, for example, are basically demonstrating the idea that they can influence politics through institutions of their own making. I think that's a clue, right, to why the absence of philanthropy. That is, instead of thinking that citizens are, right, have a direct relationship to the state, and the state in turn is obligated, like the welfare state, or that sustenance occurs in familial models that are on communal or small scales, philanthropy basically says there's this middle model where we reorganize and shape our political space, right? And we do it through the means of, right, giving. And I wonder whether there's a kind of silence about that in the sources, or I invite Benny to think about that with me. And I wonder if it's also related to a deeper silence about the role of ordinary people shaping the world around them. And I want to stop at that. But I also want to say again, first, thank you so much for having me. But also, I really learned that I didn't know anything when I taught coercing charity. And Benny's incredibly sensitive analysis, not only of the large issues, but of the small details of words in Agadot, words, right, words and verses. It was such a pleasure, and every book should be like Benny's. And I can't wait for the English one.